Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I thought the hardest part of my wedding day would be making sure everything ran smoothly, keeping the schedule tight, and avoiding any family drama, but as it turned out, the real challenge was sitting at the table where my own parents decided to humiliate me in front of a room full of people who had gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. We had just finished the dinner. Everyone was relaxed, talking and laughing, and then out of nowhere my mother leaned forward with that tone she uses when she pretends she is simply stating facts, but is really throwing daggers, and she said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, that all this money we had spent on the wedding should have gone to my sister, because she needed support. The air in my chest froze. I don't think I've ever felt that particular kind of humiliation before, the mix of shock and anger and shame all boiling at once while you are forced to sit perfectly still so you don't make a bigger scene. There were relatives, friends of my husband's family, people from work, and instead of just enjoying my moment, I was reduced in an instant to that same little girl who grew up being told to fend for herself while my sister, Melissa, was constantly in need. I didn't say a word, because that's what I've been trained to do my whole life, swallow it down, keep the peace, and let Melissa be the center of attention, because supposedly she always had it harder. What made it sting more was that it was not just my mom. My dad gave this little nod, like he agreed with her, like spending money on me was some kind of waste. And I saw the quick glance Melissa gave me across the table, almost smug, like even at my wedding she was still the main storyline. I could feel the eyes of others on me, curious to see how I'd react, maybe even pitying me, and I hated that more than anything, because I never wanted pity, I just wanted fairness. I wanted for once to not have to prove my worth or justify my happiness. In that moment, I felt myself shrinking, the same way I had when I was 16 and wanted to go to a school dance, but was told the money for the dress was better spent on Melissa's emergency car repair, which of course turned out to be a lie. Or when I was 21 and worked 2 jobs to pay tuition while Melissa dropped out of college, but somehow still had her rent covered by my parents. All those years of watching the pattern repeat, all the moments when I convinced myself I was stronger for not needing handouts, came crashing into that one statement at the table: this money should have gone to your sister. I stayed quiet, not because I was weak, but because I knew saying anything right then would just make me look bitter on a day when everyone was supposed to be celebrating. And, honestly, part of me was too exhausted to fight the same old fight again. What difference would it make? They never listened. They never cared how it felt to watch your parents invest everything into one child while expecting the other to simply figure it out alone. But then something happened that I did not see coming, and it was not me who made the move, it was my husband, David. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He didn't tell them off or try to defend me in front of everyone. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a plain white envelope, and slid it slowly across the table toward my parents. No words, no explanation, just that subtle movement that immediately changed the entire mood, because suddenly everyone was watching, wondering what could possibly be inside. I didn't even know what it was. I looked at him in confusion, and he gave me the smallest nod, the kind that said, "Trust me." My parents hesitated for a moment, and then my mother picked it up with this suspicious look on her face, almost annoyed, like she thought it was some kind of check that would prove me and David were just trying to buy respect. She opened it, pulled out the papers inside, and started reading. My dad leaned over, and I watched the color drain from his face. My mother's mouth actually parted like she couldn't find the words. The silence at that table was so heavy it felt like everyone was holding their breath. Melissa leaned closer, trying to see, but my parents folded the papers quickly, as if hiding them would make the truth less obvious. I had no idea what I was looking at, but whatever it was bad enough to make 2 people who never once admitted they were wrong suddenly go pale. And the strangest part was, David still hadn't said a word. He just sat back with his hand on mine, calm as ever, while my parents looked like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. I wanted to ask him what he had done, but I knew better than to interrupt. He was waiting, letting them sit with it, letting the silence do the work. And as much as I was desperate to know, I realized I liked watching them squirm for once, liked seeing them confronted with something they couldn't brush off or twist into another lecture about responsibility. Everyone at the table was looking around, whispering, wondering what had just happened. Melissa finally snapped, demanding to know what was in the envelope, but my parents didn't answer. They just stared down at the folded papers like they were holding a bomb. And me? I sat there torn between fear and satisfaction, because whatever David had put in that envelope, it had already changed everything. When my parents opened it, their faces went pale. And no one else at that table knew why yet. If you have ever lived in a family where one child is treated like a cause and the other is treated like a solution, you already understand how quickly a nice dinner can turn into a referendum on your worth. Because in my house, Melissa was always the emergency that needed cash, attention, and second chances, while I was the reminder that bills get paid by showing up, that grades improve when you study, and that rent is not a theory. And I wish I could tell you that recognizing that pattern early made me immune to it, but the truth is that it sits in your bones so deeply that even on your wedding night you can be transported back to being a teenager asking for a small thing and getting a lecture about sacrifice. When people ask me for examples, I could list them for an hour without taking a breath, like the time I was told that we could not afford the senior trip because Melissa was between jobs again and needed help covering a deposit. Or the year I worked weekends to keep my scholarship while Melissa promised she was turning things around and somehow turned that promise into a new round of bailouts. Or the holidays where the conversation was always a gentle circle around how hard life is for some people and how the rest of us should be supportive, and I sat there doing mental math about my own rent while my parents reassured my sister that real families never let anyone sink. Which is a comforting thought until you realize that the person being used as a lifeboat is you. David watched this long before we ever got engaged, not in a dramatic way, not with speeches about boundaries, but in a steady, practical way that made me feel both seen and slightly embarrassed, because once someone loves you without the family narrative attached, you start to hear how absurd your normal sounds when you repeat it out loud, and I remember the first time he said, with no judgment, that he had never seen parents call one kid resilient and then punish her for being resilient by making her carry every shortfall, and that sentence stuck with me because it was the first time anyone named the hustle for what it was. I did not know about the envelope, but I knew about the way David had started asking quiet questions whenever a new crisis appeared, questions like who co-signed what, and where did the money go? And why did every plan that involved Melissa include a grace period that never expired? And I noticed how he never pushed me to confront them before I was ready. He just kept a calm record in his head of what actually happened, which turned out to matter more than my parents could have imagined. So there we were at the table, my mother performing concern as if she were reading off a cue card, my father giving that half nod that always meant he agreed, but did not want to get into details, and Melissa holding court with the same blend of wounded innocence and strategic helplessness she had used since we were kids, and I could feel the old script gathering momentum, the part where I either swallow it or snap. And either way I come off as the difficult daughter, and I chose silence, not as surrender, but as refusal to give them the performance they came for, and in that space David placed the envelope, which looked ridiculous in its simplicity and felt explosive in the way my parents' faces shifted as they scanned the pages. People assume that the first hit of justice comes with fire, but honestly the first hit felt like oxygen, like my lungs finally worked again, because for once I was not the one making a scene or carrying the blame for damaging the family mood. I was the person at the center of a celebration who stayed calm while the people who had mocked the cost of my happiness realized there was a ledger they had conveniently refused to see, and it was written in their own handwriting. I could see Melissa getting restless, the way she always did when attention drifted from her version of events. And she leaned in with that patronizing little smile that makes strangers think she is charming and makes me remember every group text where she declared that rules do not apply to people under pressure, and she said that if there was something to be shared, we should not be secretive about it on such a special night, which was her favorite trick, wrapping manipulation in etiquette so that anyone who objects looks petty. I turned my hand in David's and felt him glance at me, and I knew we were thinking the same thing, that we had spent enough years being polite to a story that took and took, so I stood, not to rant and not to cry, but to exercise the one power I finally understood was mine, which is to define the frame, and I picked up the microphone with a smile that was steady and said that I wanted to thank the people who taught me the difference between support and enabling. The people who showed me that real love does not hide bills or rewrite timelines or turn a celebration into a guilt campaign, and I named my aunt who helped me learn how to budget, my former boss who fought to keep me on when a department closed, and the friends who showed up when there was no applause in it, and I let those names hang in the room while my parents tried to pretend they were not the ones excluded, and the applause that followed was not thunderous, but it was warm and clear. And in that moment my revenge was not drama, it was recognition redistributed to the people who actually deserved it. Melissa scoffed into the silence and said that this was getting awkward and that if there was some big secret in that envelope we should just say it, because secrets ruin families, and David, who had said nothing for many long minutes, finally looked at her and said in the calmest voice I have ever heard that there was no secret here at all, only records, and that if she truly wanted the table to hear what was inside, she was welcome to read it out loud herself, and then he slid the envelope toward her place setting and folded his hands, while every person within earshot leaned in without meaning to, and my heart slammed once, hard, because I knew we had just crossed from endurance to accountability, and there was no going back. If you want to understand what was inside that envelope and why my parents looked like the floor had tilted under their chairs, you have to know that David is not a man who rushes to speeches or threats. He is a man who watches patterns the way other people watch sports. And after enough holidays, enough sudden emergencies, and enough late-night calls that ended with me trying to turn my worry into yet another plan, he started connecting dots in a way I never had the bandwidth to do, not because I was naive, but because surviving a family narrative that always casts you as the sturdy one leaves you too tired to be the detective as well, so he quietly became the person who kept the timeline straight. The person who saved screenshots when my mother texted about a new crisis. The person who wrote down dates when my father said a promise would be the last one. And the person who noticed that Melissa did not stumble into drama so much as schedule it like a recurring appointment. I found out later that the envelope was not a check or a legal notice. It was a simple stack that told a story better than I ever could. A story made of messages forwarded by a cousin who was tired of being used as the soft landing, of bank transfers labeled with reasons that changed from rent to tuition to medical to car to business to just until next month, and of emails that showed my parents co-signing things they pretended were short-term while interest racked up like a quiet tax on our sanity. And at the very back there was the part that made my parents go pale, which was a printed group chat where Melissa rehearsed lines for the wedding night guilt pitch, complete with suggested wording about family values and support. And a little joke about how I would never say anything because I hated scenes, and you know what, for once I did not hate the scene that followed, because it was not mine to carry. David told me later that he had not planned to use it that evening unless they pushed, which is to say unless they turned our celebration into another fundraiser for Melissa's lifestyle, and, because they could not help themselves, they did exactly that. And when my mother delivered the line about how all this money should have gone to my sister, David understood that silence would not protect us, that ignoring it would only validate the script and invite a dozen more performances of the same, so he did not lecture or posture. He slid facts across linen, which is oddly the most respectful form of confrontation I have ever seen, because it leaves everyone the chance to choose dignity in how they respond. While my parents stared at the pages, Melissa stretched for the envelope with that breezy entitlement that always reads as confidence until you know what it costs other people, and David did not pull it back or try to stop her. He simply said that if she wanted to read it aloud, she was welcome to, and he said it like a host offering coffee, calm and friendly, which made the offer feel even more dangerous, because he was not bluffing and she knew it, and in that heartbeat I recognized the design I had missed for so many years, which is that he was not trying to humiliate anyone, he was trying to force the truth into daylight where manipulation dries up. Here is the part that will either make you cheer or make you uncomfortable, and honestly I can live with both. because it was the first time I felt protected by more than words. Before the wedding, when we built the registry, David set it up so that every cash gift routed automatically into a joint account that required both of our approvals for any transfer out, and he also added a delayed release that meant nothing could be moved on the wedding weekend, not to be controlling, but because he anticipated exactly this play, the last-minute pressure to divert funds in the name of family need. So while Melissa geared up to weaponize generosity and my parents braced to play the chorus, the money had already been quietly sheltered from the guilt machine, and when David mentioned, with the same polite voice, that we would not be opening envelopes tonight or tomorrow and that the gifts were already secured and thanked through the registry, I watched Melissa's expression flicker from outrage to calculation to something like panic, because the lever she planned to pull was suddenly not connected to anything. My parents recovered enough to ask what exactly they were looking at, and David, still measured, walked them through the timeline without judgment. He pointed to the message where Melissa suggested making a scene about support during our toasts because it lands better when the room is sentimental. He pointed to the bank transfers that contradicted the story that help was rare and reluctant. He pointed to the cosign lines where my father had written his name while telling me he could not help me with a small emergency because it would not be fair to Melissa, and he did not raise his voice or call them names. He just held up a mirror and let them hear their own words on paper, which is a sound far louder than shouting. And then he said that every person in this family deserved to know the truth if they were being recruited into a lie, and that set off the reaction you can imagine, because nothing terrifies a manipulative system like transparency. Melissa said he had no right to share private conversations. My mother said this was not the time or the place. My father said we could discuss it later, and I finally found my voice without shaking, because I realized that later is the adverb that keeps women like me stuck in permanent delay. So I said that the time and place were chosen for us the second they turned our wedding into a referendum on my worth, and that from this moment forward there would be no more backroom guilt campaigns. Only clear boundaries and accountable math, and then I said something I had never said to my parents in my life, which was that if they truly believe the family should hear what is inside that envelope, they should invite Melissa to read it aloud right now. And to make it easier, I would airdrop the file to the entire table so no one had to squint. David lifted his phone as if to follow through, not as a bluff, but as a courtesy, and the room went so still you could feel the tension rather than hear it. And Melissa reached across the table with a hand that looked steadier than it was and said she would read it herself because she had nothing to hide, and I watched her fingertips touch the top sheet. And then she froze when she saw the first printed chat where she had rehearsed how to shame me without looking cruel, and she looked up with that practiced innocence that has bailed her out since childhood, and said the screenshots were out of context, and David, still gentle, said that context is exactly what the last page provides. Because the last page is not a screenshot at all but a signed agreement with a venue coordinator and a charity liaison that explains what happens if anyone tries to redirect our wedding gifts under false pretenses. And Melissa blinked twice like she was recalculating her next move, while my parents finally understood that the ground rules had changed, which is when David said, very softly so only our table could hear, that if they insisted on continuing the speech about support, he would honor the theme in his own way by sharing the most supportive thing Melissa ever did for herself, and then he tapped the last page with one fingertip and asked her to explain, in her own words, why her name appeared next to the phrase personal guarantee on a loan that listed my parents' house as collateral. There are moments in life when the room you are sitting in feels like it has been split into two versions of reality, one that has been rehearsed for years and another that is breaking open right in front of your eyes, and that night at my wedding. The line between those two realities snapped in full view of relatives, friends, and even distant acquaintances who had never been close enough to see how my family truly operated. The envelope had already unsettled my parents, but what followed was the slow, undeniable unraveling of the script they had protected for decades, and while part of me wanted to retreat and escape the storm, another part of me, the part that had been silenced for too long, knew that this was the only chance to let the truth stand on its own feet, without me having to scream or beg anyone to believe me. Melissa, who had built her entire adult life on performing helplessness while extracting every possible bailout, was not about to let a stack of printed records destroy her carefully crafted role, so she leaned forward, her smile tightening into that sharp edge I had seen in private arguments, but never in public, and she accused David of manipulating the situation, of twisting harmless loans into some sinister conspiracy, and of embarrassing the family on what was supposed to be a joyful occasion. My mother quickly chimed in, trying to drown out the confrontation with her usual lines about family loyalty and how some matters should remain private, and my father mumbled something about how maybe this was not the right time. But David stayed calm in a way that made every word he spoke sound more credible, because he never raised his voice, never insulted anyone, never broke eye contact. He simply pointed out, with precision, that every document in that envelope came directly from either a bank statement, a contract, or Melissa's own messages, and that nothing had been altered. The reaction around the table shifted in a way that I felt deep in my stomach, because the extended relatives who had always nodded politely at my parents' narratives were beginning to whisper among themselves, exchanging glances that said they were recalculating what they thought they knew. Some of them had lent Melissa money and never been repaid. Others had been guilt-tripped into covering her rent or co-signing small loans. But none of them had realized just how orchestrated the entire pattern was until they saw it laid out in black and white. It was as if the invisible weight that had always pressed down on me was suddenly visible to everyone else, and for the first time in my life, I did not have to carry it alone. Melissa tried another tactic, accusing me of being behind the entire setup, of planting resentment in David's head and using him to do my dirty work, but I did not take the bait. I simply sat there with my hand resting on his, watching her scramble, while David reminded her, in that steady tone, that she was free to deny any single page of what was presented, because every single page could be verified within minutes by calling the bank or the creditor listed. He gave her the chance to refute facts with facts, and of course she could not, so she resorted to claiming that the context was different, that these were temporary arrangements, that everyone exaggerates when they vent in group chats, and the more she talked, the more obvious it became that she was cornered by her own history. The part that broke the silence most powerfully was when my aunt, who had always been quiet during family disputes, leaned across the table and asked Melissa directly why she had never mentioned that my parents' house was on the line for one of her loans. Because my aunt recognized the lender's name on the document and understood immediately what it meant. My mother tried to brush it off, claiming it was a precaution that would never come into play, but the damage was already done. Everyone at that table now understood that my parents had risked their own stability for Melissa while continuing to tell me that they could not afford to help me with the smallest things, like when my car broke down and I had to borrow from friends just to get to work. The tension in the room was unbearable, not because it was loud, but because it was so quiet you could hear forks clinking against plates as people shifted uncomfortably, no longer able to pretend that the story of Melissa the victim and me the strong, ungrateful daughter was true. Melissa finally snapped, slamming her hand against the table and declaring that none of this mattered, that family is supposed to support one another, and that dragging private matters into the open was cruel and vindictive. But David responded with one final line that sliced through every protest. He said that real support is transparent, shared, and accountable, and that enabling someone to drain others behind closed doors is not support at all. It is betrayal disguised as kindness. I watched my parents' faces as that sentence hung in the air, and I could see that, for the first time, they were not able to rally their usual defenses because they were too busy calculating how many people at that table now knew the truth. Melissa stormed out in a burst of rage, leaving her plate untouched, and the silence that followed was even heavier than before, because my parents could not chase her without admitting that everything on those pages was real. They stayed seated, stiff and pale, while the rest of the family began to murmur, not loudly, but enough that the illusion was shattered permanently. I should have felt guilty for how public it became, but instead I felt something I had not felt in years, a quiet, steady satisfaction that the lies had finally cracked under their own weight. Yet, even as I sat there, I knew the envelope was not the final move, because David had prepared for the long game, not just the short-term shock, and as much as Melissa's public unraveling was satisfying, I could feel there was another card waiting to be played. One that would not just expose her, but change the balance of power in a way no one could reverse. And I knew it was coming, because David had promised me once that the only way to stop a cycle is to break it cleanly, and in that moment, I understood that the break had only just begun. If you have ever lived your entire life in the shadow of someone else's excuses, carrying the weight of their mistakes while being told that your own struggles did not count because you were strong enough, then you will understand why the night of my wedding was not simply about defending myself from another round of humiliation. It was about breaking a chain that had been wrapped around me since childhood. And as satisfying as it was to watch Melissa storm out and my parents sit in silence, with their carefully rehearsed lines collapsing in front of them, I knew the envelope had not been the end of David's plan, because unlike me, who had always reacted to the fire in the moment, David believed in finishing things so completely that there was no room left for revision or manipulation. In the days leading up to the wedding, I had noticed him staying up late with his laptop, not in a secretive way, but in that quiet, deliberate way he does when he is solving something that cannot be left halfway. And I assumed he was handling last-minute details about the vendors or the guest list, because those were the kinds of things I was too tired to double-check myself. Yet what he was really doing was building a safeguard that would close every door Melissa and my parents had used for years to turn my milestones into platforms for guilt. Inside that envelope there had not only been the stack of records and receipts, but also another document folded neatly at the back, one that he knew my parents would understand instantly but would not dare to read out loud. And that was the copy of a property deed showing that he and I had already secured a house together, completely in our own names, purchased in cash from the savings we had built quietly while everyone assumed we were living paycheck to paycheck. The significance of that deed was not just the house itself, but the fact that attached to it were disclaimers from a financial advisor stating that any attempts to redirect wedding gifts or coerce us into signing joint obligations with family members would be legally void, because our assets were fully independent and protected. And that meant the old game, the one where Melissa made a plea, my parents guaranteed her loans, and then hinted that I should help absorb the fallout, was now structurally impossible. David had not only exposed the manipulation, he had cut off the pipeline that kept it alive. And the look on my parents' faces when they realized it was not just a confrontation, but a permanent closure was worth every single year I had spent being overlooked. I sat there in stunned silence while David explained in his calm voice that what he and I were building together was not going to be jeopardized by anyone else's irresponsibility, that we would not be the emergency fund or the backup plan, and that the only support we were willing to offer would be emotional, not financial, because emotional support is given freely and cannot be twisted, but money and signatures always come with chains, and we were done being tied down. My parents tried to argue, my mother saying that family means sacrifice, and my father muttering that David was turning me against them. But the words landed flat, because the room knew too much now and their audience was gone. And for once they had to sit in the consequences without being rescued by the illusion of noble selflessness. The relatives who had witnessed the exchange were not quick to take sides openly, but the silence told me more than words ever could, because silence in that moment was agreement that the story had changed forever. Melissa had already left in anger, but what she did not know yet, and what my parents were only beginning to realize, was that by signing as guarantors for her last round of debts, they had entangled themselves so deeply that their own home was at risk if she failed to pay, and that was the other page in the envelope David had shown them discreetly, the one that listed their liability in numbers they could not deny. It was not cruelty, it was reality printed in black ink, and it left them pale because for once they understood they had backed themselves into a corner that I would not help pull them out of. The beauty of it was that I never had to raise my voice or deliver a dramatic speech, because David had designed the moment so that their own choices spoke louder than anything I could have said. I did not need to prove my worth, I did not need to beg for recognition. I simply needed to stand still while the scaffolding of favoritism and manipulation collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. For the first time, I was not the one carrying the shame. I was the one watching it return to its rightful owners, and that shift was the kind of victory that lingers long after the party ends. When the night was finally over and we were alone, I asked David why he went so far, why he did not just let the humiliation roll off my back like I always had, and he said something I will never forget. He said that marriage is about building a life together that cannot be hijacked by anyone else's failures, and that he would never stand by while my family turned me into collateral. That sentence, spoken in the calm after the storm, was worth more than every gift on the table, because it was the promise I had been waiting for my entire life, the promise that I did not have to fight alone anymore. So when people ask me now if I regret how messy that night became, I tell them no, because it was the first time the truth finally lived in daylight, the first time silence was not my cage but my weapon, and the first time I walked away not wondering if I should have defended myself harder, but knowing that I had already won. My parents learned that their leverage was gone. Melissa learned that her script no longer worked, and I learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not loud or cruel. It is the simple act of closing a door that has been used against you and locking it forever. And as I lay in bed that night, exhausted but strangely at peace, I realized that the pale look on my parents' faces was not just shock, it was the recognition that the era of control was over. And the silence they left me with was worth more than every apology they never gave.